Hello there, Mad Mike here, and welcome back to the channel. So today we unfortunately have the sad news that actor Rip Torn has passed away at the age of 88. Now, for those people who don't know who Rip Torn was, he one of his more memorable roles would be as Agent Zed from Men in Black. He was in both Men in Black 1 and 2 in a prominent way, and he was also in 3, but it was just his picture because they technically had his funeral, which is kind of ironic. Um, he had a reoccurring role on shows like 30 Rock, um, as well as a major role on the Larry Sanders Show, which was on in the late 80s, in the mid to late 90s. Um, Among others, he had a lot of very early television roles on prominent shows at the time, like The Man from U.N.C.L.E., Combat, The Untouchables, The Alfred Hitchcock Hour, Bonanza, and the list goes on. But Rip Torn is one of those actors that he's kind of one of those guys that it's like, oh, you see him in a movie, it's like, oh, it's that guy. Because he was in so many things, not all of them good, mind you. He was in Freddy Got Fingered and a few other things that were not very, very good. But ultimately, most of his roles were very enjoyable. In fact, he was also nominated for an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for his film Cross Creek that came out in 1983. Um, so he was a relatively good actor, but he found most of his success in comedy. He was very good at doing comedic style stuff. You kind of saw that he did the very deadpan delivery when he played Zed in Men in Black. Obviously, he was the eccentric producer on the Larry Sanders Show, and you know 30 Rock, a comedy show. He was also on Will and Grace. He was on so many television shows, but he really found most of his success later on in his career in comedy. And keep in mind, his career spanned from the late 50s all the way until 2013, I believe. Was actually, sorry, 2016 was his last on-screen performance. Well, not on screen, but his last performance, which was a television performance for the show Trip Tank, which I'm not exactly familiar with. He voiced a character called M, but uh, he really exemplified kind of that. He had that very deadpan type of humor that really worked, where he was very eccentric but he was serious, but it came off very goofy. He took himself to the serious. When he was playing a character a lot of the time, he would take himself so serious that it would come off amusing, and that kind of voice that he had really helped with that. He also had a Broadway career again in the 50s, where he was relatively successful. He even directed one of the plays he was in, but he was in 10 plays, and this was in the 50s before he started getting picked up on a lot of those older television shows. But this is what you see a lot with older actors. Is in the 50s and 60s, a lot of them would have these roles on television shows if they didn't really have a prominent film presence at the time. William Shatner did that a lot, where you saw him in Twilight Zone in the early 60s before he eventually hit Star Trek, and then TJ Hooker and stuff like that. He really didn't make his foray into film really until the Star Trek films started getting adapted into movies. He was also on The Man from U.N.C.L.E. I think he was on an episode of Bonanza as well. Most people were, it seems like back then. But Rip Torn is just one of those guys that you see him in so much stuff that you almost get used to seeing him in things. And it's been kind of odd the last few years to kind of not see him in some of the even those bit parts that he used to get a lot of the time. Uh, just as a side role in films and stuff like that. And it's so nice when you see somebody who is a veteran actor, who he knows exactly what they're doing and knows how to play what they play, and they do it to perfection. And that's really what Rip Torn was. That's really what his bread and butter was through a majority of his career. Was he was always the best next guy down, essentially. He wasn't the Clark. He wasn't the headliner. He wasn't the guy whose name was the biggest, but he was right below it, and he knew how to do it perfectly. And again, he sat in that role for a very long time, but he does a very good job of complementing other characters. Again, if you watch Men in Black, the first one especially, um, the interactions between him and Tommy Lee Jones are very good. You know, he plays that very good kind of old friend type of character. At least he did in his later career. But you know, he's one of those guys that he's even though he hasn't had an on-screen presence, it is still sad to see him pass. Um, I know that he had had past issues with alcoholism and things like that. I don't necessarily know the circumstances of the death, or you know whether or not that had something to do with it. But at this point, Rip Torn has passed away at the age of 88 in his home in Connecticut. So I'd like to know your thoughts on this. Were you a fan of any of Rip Torn's work? If you liked a movie that he was in, put it in the comments, or a television show, or an episode that he was on, put it in the comments. Again, I like to know what you're thinking. I like to hear your thoughts. Remember to hit the bell for notifications, hit the like button, subscribe, and remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?